Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's been too long, hasn't it? Recently I've been guest designing for Magenta Style, and today is the last post for the series. The card I'm showing you today incorporates a fair bit of watercolor painting in various steps that would make it extensive to explain in the blog post, hence the video. Mes excuses, toute la vidéo est en anglais. Mon français n'est pas assez bon à utiliser en public. Je suis désolée. I started by stamping the apple blossom bouquet stamp onto watercolor paper. Actually, I started by stamping on masking paper and cutting it out to give myself a mask that I could build a background around. Next, I used 4 different shades of inks, different brands as well, in muted tones of green, blue, brown, and gray, and I filled in the background with a couple of magenta foliage stamps that I'll link below, both in the blog post and in the video comments. So then I went ahead and cut out the main portion of the bouquet that I wanted to use on my card front. And I stamped and cut out a few extra leaves as well so that I could just fill in the background behind the bouquet stamp. Then I pulled out my watercolor paints to paint the stamped image and the extra leaves. I know how mesmerizing I find it to watch other artists as they paint, so I'm leaving this stretch of long video complete for you to watch. Feel free to skip ahead to the rest though if watching paint dry is as boring as it sounds. For the flowers themselves, I like to build layers of color, and I don't like to paint every flower the exact same shade because you don't find exact sameness in nature. So 2 of the flowers are painted pink, but the 3rd flower has some orange added to the pink. The difference is subtle and you might not even notice if I didn't point it out, but it's there and it makes me feel better. Sometimes watercolor painting is as much about taking color away as it is putting it down. You can see right now I'm using sort of a dry brush, it's called a thirsty brush, to pick up some of that intensity of color that I've left there. And you can even see how you can push paint, pigment, and water around with the tip of your brush. I like to lay in darker, more intense color towards the center of the flower where the shadow would be, and then use a wet, clean brush to come from the outside edges towards that intense color so that then it can naturally wick the color back towards the tip. You'll see a better example of what I mean in a moment. Now for the leaves. I began just by laying down one flat color of green all over the whole leaves, and then I went back and added to the puddles of paint that were already on my palette a little bit of blue, a little bit of green, and went back over the leaves that I had previously done before they were completely dry to add in those extra shades of color. Again, I like to lay darker color in just under the petal of the flower because that's where the shadow would be. And I like to bring in, again, more of those tints so that as they dry they can kind of blend together and exercise that magic that watercolor painting is. At this point now, I wanted to add in some darker color yet in behind the 3 flowers because that's where it would be the most shaded. Watch now how I add in some more of the darkest shade of green under the leaves, the petals of the flowers. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned how I use a wet, clean brush to wick that color out. If I had left it, it would dry with those harsh lines, which would be obvious and not very pretty. At this point now, I used those same 3 shades of ink that I had used for stamping the foliage on the background, and I wanted to watercolor paint with them. I had better success with the water-based paints more so than the dye-based inks, I should say, not paints. But I wanted to make sure that I had exact same shades as I had already used for the inking. I do go back to my paint palette to bring in more of the same shades that I've already used to paint the apple blossoms and leaves themselves. And then at this point I started adding in color to the stamped leaves in the background. I quite like that look, and I ended up adding more leaves just at my own whim in spots where I thought it looked nice. Again, I'm just adding more of the same colors that I've already been using that are in my paint palette, adding to those main puddles little bits more of yellow and blue, just to very subtly change the colors of greens that I'm painting with. I wouldn't want every leaf the exact same color, again, as I said before, because that's not what you see in nature. I'm adding in leaves to the background that will in all likelihood be covered by the apple blossom design that's going on the front of the card. But my motto in life, as anybody who knows me well can tell you, is anything worth doing is worth overdoing, and it never hurts to be thorough. And now that I can see how the card front is looking with the apple blossom die cut out and laid on top, I can see that I want to fill in the background with a little bit more color. So I bring in more of the same colors that I've been using, some yellow, a little bit more blue, and finally a pop of some of the pink that I used in the flowers themselves. The reason to do that is just to give a more cohesive look from the top layer right through to the background layer. Now I'm just outlining the edges of this stamped and cut out piece to give it a more finished look. And it wouldn't be one of my watercolor cards if it weren't finished with some ink splatters at the end. So I just do that by scribbling some Tombow markers on my splat mat and diluting it with a bit of water, and then using a fairly small brush and tapping it on my finger to get really fine ink splatters. To finish the card, I fold a piece of Nina 110-pound cardstock in the cream color, I forget the name of it, and trim the card panel 1/8 inch narrower on each side. Then I cover the back of the stamped cut out flower bouquet with foam tape and position it on the front of the card panel and arrange my extra leaves in behind the bouquet in a way that's most aesthetically pleasing. Those extra leaves are taped down flat to the card panel, tucked underneath the dimensional foam tape. And then I realized I had neglected to finish the flower centers, so I just brought in a yellow Arteza marker and colored those in. Then I felt that some of my details from my background stamping had gotten lost with the layers of watercolor paint over top, so I just used some water-based markers that closely matched the colors of the original stamping and just went over some of the lines, added in some definition to leaves, and generally more detail to the foliage. I created the sentiment by stamping the Thinking of You stamp 3 or 4 times on watercolor paper and heat embossing it with clear embossing powder and trimming it down before adding it to the card front. I added a little piece of foam tape to the end of the sentiment so that it wouldn't be crushed if I send it in the mail. And I added a few enamel dots, just 3 this time, and this card is complete. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and hopefully it won't be so long till the next one. Have a wonderful day.